this is your typical neuron. First we have the cell body. Now coming from that we have dendrites. There are many of these dendrites. These are called dendrites. They actually surround the whole cell body. Then we have the axon. And on that axon, we have all of these nodes called the nodes of Ranvier. We also have the end of the axon, the terminus, axon. Middle. We also have the axon hillock at the beginning of the axon. And sometimes wrapped around these axons is a substance called myelin. Myelin. So let's go over what each of these does. So the cell body is often where larger molecules of neurotransmitter are being packaged. But the cell body is also it's synthesizing all of the information based on the DNA and also based off of all of the different signals it's receiving from the dendrites. And the dendrites will either receive excitatory or inhibitory signals. Or inhibitory signals. Now, based off of what it will receive, that is going to determine whether or not an action potential will be carried out. When an action potential is carried out, that basically means that the threshold is reached. This cell body is slightly negative. And when it receives enough excitatory information through the dendrites, a certain threshold is reached where sodium channels will open. Electrically gated sodium channels will open. And that electrical signal will carry on down the axon, which is filled with sodium channels. So all the sodium channels will fly open. The electrical signal will basically be carried to the axon terminal. And at the axon terminal, what will happen is those electrical signals will be converted to a neurotransmitter substance, and it will move on to the next cell that it needs to affect. So let's go over some of these elements a little bit more. The nodes of Ranvier are little nodes on this axon which allows that electrical impulse to jump from node to node. And again, they're filled with sodium channels, electrically gated. Now, myelin is a substance that's often produced by glial cells, and it wraps around the axon, and it allows these things to happen very fast. So it almost happens simultaneously. The myelin basically facilitates the action potential to travel very fast to the axon terminal and to affect the next cell. Now, the axon hillock is the origination point of the axon. This is basically where all the electrical impulses are kind of processed, and whether the neuron decides whether or not this information is going to be carried down. So as noted, each neuron has a resting membrane potential. And this means that the cell, the neuron, is slightly negative. So that means that it's not going to fire unless it receives enough excitatory impulses. So the resting membrane potential is needed because it keeps the cell slightly negative. That way it's not just always firing. Now, something really instrumental in this is the sodium and potassium pump. And these ions travel in and out of the cell, of the neuron. And because one is slightly more negative than the other, and there's more negative going in than going out, it balances the cell and it keeps it in a state of rest. So since the cell is slightly negative, a certain threshold needs to be reached for an action potential to be initiated. Now, how this happens is the dendrites either receive an inhibitory postsynaptic potential or an excitatory postsynaptic potential. Now, there's a lot of nuances to this, which I don't have time to go into here, but basically, if the dendrites receive enough of the excitatory postsynaptic potentials, then that threshold level will be reached. The cell will have a more positive charge, and that is what determines whether or not the action potential is going to be initiated, and that electrical impulse will travel down the axon and to the next cell that is going to affect. Let's take a look at a few terms related to the firing of an action potential. Depolarization refers to what happens when the cell receives enough excitatory impulses that it causes the sodium channels to open. So this cell is basically becoming more positively charged, causing the sodium channels to open and the action potentials to be fired. Depolarization. In repolarization, after the axon potential is fired, potassium actually rushes out of the cell. Now this leads to hyperpolarization, which means the cell is slightly more negative than usual, slightly more negatively charged than usual. And this hyperpolarization happens so that we don't go backwards. So now more excitatory impulses are needed to fire another action potential. This period of hyperpolarization is often referred to as the refractory period. Now let's talk a little bit more about neurotransmitter molecules. Small neurotransmitter molecules are stored in the terminal button and synthesized in synaptic vesicles. Now larger molecules are actually packaged in the cell body and sent to the axon terminus through synaptic vesicles that travel down the axon. So here's how one neuron affects another. So when the action potential reaches the terminus, calcium channels open, and this causes the terminus, the vesicles in there, to fuse with the terminal membrane and release the content. So specific neurotransmitters have specific receptors. And basically what happens is the neurotransmitter, it either creates an excitatory or inhibitory postsynaptic potential, and that goes on to affect the next cell. Because remember how the dendrites receive the inhibitory postsynaptic potentials or the excitatory postsynaptic potentials? Well, those postsynaptic potentials are being received from the prior cell that's fired. So you're probably wondering why all this is important. Well, this is our behavior on a cellular level, combining information from our environment with the DNA that's already in our cells to create these electrical impulses that are transformed into neurotransmitters that affect one cell after another and cause us to react certain ways or feel certain things in response to other things. For example, the sense of pleasure or dopamine that we get from eating one of our favorite foods. That's all. Thank you for watching.